Those beams of my headlamp cut through the inky darkness, illuminating a narrow path ahead as I trudged deeper into the Michigan wilderness. Crickets chirped in the underbrush, and leaves crunched beneath my boots. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, carrying the earthy scent of decaying vegetation. My name is Tom Riker, and I'm a wildlife researcher specializing in endangered species in the upper Midwest. Tonight marked the start of a month-long solo expedition in the dense forests of northern Michigan. My goal was to document the flora and fauna in this remote region, with a particular focus on tracking the movements of timber wolves and black bears. As I hiked further from civilization, excitement coursed through me. There's nothing quite like being alone in true wilderness, surrounded by nature in its purest form. Sure, it could be unnerving at times, especially on moonless nights like this one, but for me the forest had always felt like home. After several miles, I reached a small clearing that would serve as my base camp for the next few weeks. I quickly set up my tent and gear before settling in for the night. Sleep came easily after the long day of travel. I jolted awake sometime in the early morning hours. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, a long, mournful howl echoing through the trees. I sat up, suddenly alert. There was something off about that sound. It was deeper than any wolf call I'd ever heard, with an almost guttural quality. A shiver ran down my spine. Just a wolf, I muttered, trying to convince myself. Probably just sounds strange because of how the sound is carrying. I laid back down, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the tent, I unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and damp. Mist clung to the ground, giving the forest an ethereal quality. After a quick breakfast, I set out to begin my research. The day passed uneventfully as I cataloged plant species and set up trail cameras. By late afternoon, my pack was laden with soil and vegetation samples. I was looking forward to analyzing them back at camp, and as I made my way back, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes boring into me. I picked up my pace, eager to return to the relative safety of my tent. That night, the strange howls returned. They seemed closer this time, and there was no mistaking the inhuman quality of the sound. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered in my years of field research. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by unsettling dreams of glowing eyes in the darkness. The next morning, I decided to investigate the source of the howls. I told myself it was purely scientific curiosity, but deep down, I knew I needed to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation. I set out in the direction I thought the sounds had come from, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of large predators. After about an hour of hiking, I froze in my tracks. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot. The impression was deep, indicating whatever made it was incredibly heavy. But the shape, it was all wrong. Too elongated for a bear, with what looked like claw marks at the end of each toe. I knelt down to examine it more closely, my heart pounding. This was no bear print. It looked almost canine, but that was impossible. No wolf could leave a print this large, and the shape was too humanoid. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I whirled around, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the usual bird calls and insect buzzing fading away. I could hear my own ragged breathing in the silence. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement in my peripheral vision. Something large and dark darted between the trees about 50 yards away. I caught a glimpse of matted fur and a hulking bipedal shape before it vanished into the underbrush. My blood ran cold. What I'd just seen was impossible. It couldn't be real. I must be hallucinating from lack of sleep. That was the only explanation. I practically ran back to camp, my mind reeling. I needed to radio for help, to get out of these woods as soon as possible. But as I burst into the clearing where my tent stood, I stopped short. My campsite was in shambles. The tent had been shredded, its contents strewn across the ground. My provisions were torn open, food scattered everywhere, and there, slashed into the bark of a nearby tree, were 3 deep claw marks. I sank to my knees, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. This was no bear attack. Bears don't deliberately destroy campsites like this. This was something else. Something that wanted me to know it had been here, that it could get to me whenever it wanted. With shaking hands, I pulled out my satellite phone to call for an emergency extraction. But as I raised it to my ear, my blood turned to ice. There was no signal. I was completely cut off. As the realization of my situation sank in, a low growl emanated from the tree line. I slowly turned, my heart in my throat. There, half hidden in shadow, stood a nightmare made flesh. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its body was a twisted hybrid of man and wolf, powerfully muscled and standing on 2 legs, but with the head of a massive canine. Yellow eyes gleamed with predatory intelligence as it bared rows of dagger-like teeth. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen in place, my body refusing to respond as primal terror overwhelmed me. The creature took a step forward, saliva dripping from its jaws. This was it. I was going to die here, alone in the woods, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for the end, but it didn't come. When I finally found the courage to look again, the thing was gone. Only the destroyed campsite remained as evidence that it had ever been there at all. I spent that night huddled in what remained of my tent, clutching my hunting knife and jumping at every sound. Sleep was impossible. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I kept expecting to see those yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, to feel hot breath on the back of my neck. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I had survived the night, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get back to civilization, to warn someone about what was out here. I hastily packed what supplies I could salvage and set out. But as I hiked, a sense of unease grew. The forest seemed different somehow. Paths I was sure I recognized led to unfamiliar places. It was as if the woods themselves were shifting around me, trying to keep me lost. By midday, I had to admit the truth to myself. I was hopelessly turned around. The comforting weight of my GPS was gone, likely destroyed along with the rest of my electronics. I had no way to navigate beyond my own faltering sense of direction. As the realization of my predicament sank in, panic began to set in. I was lost in the wilderness, being hunted by something out of a nightmare, with dwindling supplies and no way to call for help. How long could I survive out here? How long before that thing caught up with me again? A rustling in the underbrush sent me diving for cover. I peered out from behind a fallen log, my knife clutched in a white-knuckled grip, but it was only a deer, bounding away through the trees. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. I was jumping at shadows now. I needed to keep it together if I was going to survive this. As I stood up, something caught my eye. There, half hidden by leaves, was a scrap of bright orange fabric snagged on a branch. I approached cautiously, heart pounding. It was a strip of nylon from a tent, and not my tent. I searched the area and found more signs of a campsite, a crushed soda can, the remains of a fire pit. This spot had been used recently, but the state of it sent chills down my spine. Everything was scattered and torn, just like my own camp had been. Claw marks scored nearby trees. Whatever was out here, I wasn't its first victim. As that realization sank in, a piercing howl split the air. It was close, too close. I took off running, branches whipping my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear something large moving through the forest behind me, gaining ground with every second. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Finally, I burst out of the tree line into a small town. I staggered down the main street, gasping for breath and wild-eyed. A few startled locals stared as I passed, and I burst into the sheriff's office, babbling about monsters in the woods. The deputies exchanged looks, clearly thinking I was some lunatic or drug addict. But as my story poured out, their expressions changed from skepticism to concern. "Mister, you better come sit down," one of them said, guiding me to a chair. "Sounds like you had yourself an encounter with the Michigan Dogman." "The what?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "It's an old legend around these parts," the deputy explained. "Been sightings going back hundreds of years. Most folks write it off as campfire stories, but every now and then, someone comes stumbling out of those woods with a tale just like yours. I shook my head in disbelief. That's impossible. I'm a scientist. I don't believe in cryptids or urban legends. The deputy's expression was grim. Believe what you want, but something's out in those woods. Something that's been taking campers and hikers for generations. We've found the remains sometimes. What's left of them anyway. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the destroyed campsite I'd found. How many others had fallen victim to that thing? My advice, the deputy continued, get in your car and drive as far away from here as you can. Don't stop until you hit the state line. And whatever you do, don't go back into those woods. I nodded numbly, my mind reeling. As I stepped out of the sheriff's office, I gazed back at the tree line looming in the distance. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a pair of yellow eyes gleaming in the shadows, watching me. I shuddered and turned away. I didn't know if I believed in the Michigan Dogman, but I knew with certainty that something was out there, something hungry, something that saw humans as prey, and somehow I knew this wasn't over. Those woods were calling to me now. A primal part of my brain was drawn to the mystery, the need to understand what I'd encountered. Even as the rest of me screamed to run and never look back, I hailed a taxi and left the town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far I went, those yellow eyes would be watching, waiting for me to return. Because deep down I knew I would. The Dogman and I weren't finished yet. The weeks following my harrowing encounter in the Michigan woods were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sound of howls echoing in my ears. Every shadow seemed to hide glowing eyes, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I tried to throw myself into my work, to forget what I'd seen, but the memory of that creature, the Michigan Dogman, haunted me. I knew I should stay away. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to forget about it, to chalk it up to stress and an overactive imagination. But I couldn't let it go. The scientist in me needed answers. What was that thing? How could it exist, and why had it let me live? It was those questions that led me back to northern Michigan 3 months later. I told myself I was just following up on my research, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was hunting the Dogman now. This time I came prepared. My pack was laden with top-of-the-line camera equipment, including night vision and thermal imaging. I had a high-powered rifle slung over my shoulder. For protection, I told myself, though the thought of actually using it made me queasy. I wasn't here to hurt the creature. I just wanted proof. As I drove into the small town near where I'd had my encounter, a sense of unease settled over me. The locals eyed me suspiciously as I stopped for supplies. They knew why I was here. I could see it in their wary glances and hushed whispers. An old man approached me as I loaded up my truck. His weathered face was etched with concern. "You're going back in there, aren't you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded, not bothering to deny it. He sighed, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake, son. That thing out there, it ain't natural. It ain't meant to be understood by the likes of us." "I have to know," I replied. "I have to understand what I saw." The old man's eyes were sad. Folks have been trying to understand the Dogman for generations. Most of them never came back. Those that did were never the same. He paused, fixing me with an intense stare. "It ain't just some animal, you know. It's smart and it's evil." A chill ran down my spine, but I steeled myself. "I appreciate your concern, sir, but I have to do this." He nodded resignedly. "I can see there's no talking you out of it. But remember this. If you go looking for the Dogman, you'll find it. And once it knows you're looking, it won't stop hunting you. Not ever." With those ominous words ringing in my ears, I set out into the forest. The familiar scents of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils as I hiked deeper into the wilderness. Every snapping twig made me flinch, every shadow seemed to move. But nothing attacked. I set up camp in a different clearing than before, well away from the site of my previous encounter. As night fell, I activated my array of cameras and sensors. If anything approached, I'd know about it. The first few days passed uneventfully. I went about my research, trying to act as if this was just another expedition. But my eyes constantly scanned the tree line, and my hand never strayed far from my rifle. On the fourth night it happened. A proximity alarm jolted me awake. Something large was moving just beyond the edge of my camp. I grabbed my night vision camera with trembling hands and peered into the darkness. And there it was, the Dogman. It stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, its yellow eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. It was every bit as terrifying as I remembered, a monstrous fusion of man and wolf, radiating predatory power. This time, though, my fear was tempered by scientific curiosity. I began snapping photos, my heart pounding. The creature's ears twitched at the sound of the shutter, but it made no move to attack. It simply watched me, its gaze unnervingly intelligent. For nearly an hour, we remained locked in this standoff. I documented its every move, filling the camera's memory with priceless evidence. This would change everything, proof that cryptids were real. My name would go down in scientific history. Just as I was considering trying to get closer, the Dogman's demeanor changed. Its ears flattened against its skull, and it bared its teeth in a vicious snarl. Before I could react, it vanished into the woods, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. I sat in stunned silence for several minutes, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally worked up the courage to review the photos, my elation turned to ashes. Every single image was distorted beyond recognition. Nothing but blurry shapes and lens flare. Somehow the creature had known. It had let me photograph it, only to ensure I had no usable evidence. The realization sent a chill through me. This thing wasn't just some animal. It was toying with me. The next few days were a nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse. I'd catch glimpses of the Dogman watching me from afar, always staying just out of clear sight. Every attempt to document it failed. Cameras malfunctioned, audio recordings picked up nothing but static. It was maddening. As my frustration grew, so did my recklessness. I began pushing deeper into the woods, determined to corner the creature. I stopped taking basic precautions, my obsession overriding my common sense. It was on one of these ill-advised excursions that I made a chilling discovery. I stumbled upon a cave hidden behind a thick curtain of vines. The entrance was marked with those now familiar claw marks. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I went inside. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a nightmare. Bones littered the floor, some animal, some disturbingly human. Tattered scraps of clothing and shredded camping gear spoke of years of victims. The walls were covered in crude, claw-marked pictographs. They seemed to depict the Dogman's hunts through the ages, growing more numerous in recent years. I had found its lair, and in doing so I realized the true scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just some undiscovered species. It was an apex predator that had been hunting humans for centuries. As that realization sank in, a low growl echoed from the depths of the cave. I whirled around, my flashlight beam landing on a pair of glowing eyes emerging from the darkness. The Dogman had returned home, and I was trapped. I ran. Blind terror lent me speed as I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face. I could hear it behind me, moving with preternatural silence save for the occasional snarl. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time. This was just part of the hunt. Just as my legs were about to give out, I burst into a small clearing. In the center stood a decrepit cabin, long abandoned. It was my only chance. I dove inside, slamming the door behind me and bracing it with my body. For hours I huddled in the musty cabin, listening to the creature prowl outside. Occasionally, it would slam against the walls, testing for weaknesses. Each impact made the whole structure shudder. I knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way in. As dawn approached, a desperate plan formed in my mind. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was my only chance. I took out my satellite phone, which had stubbornly refused to work since I entered these woods, and smashed it on the floor. Using the shards of the screen, I began to cut my arm, letting the blood flow freely. The coppery scent filled the air. Outside, the Dogman grew more frenzied, clawing at the walls. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Then I threw open the door and ran. I could hear it behind me, no longer bothering with stealth. The sound of its breathing, the impact of its footfalls spurred me to greater speed. My plan hinged on one desperate hope, that the Dogman was at least partly animal, and like any animal, it could be lured into a trap. I led it on a winding path, doubling back and crossing my own trail. All the while, my blood left a trail for it to follow. Finally, I reached my destination, the cave where I'd found its lair. I ducked inside, pressing myself against the wall just inside the entrance. The dogman's bulk filled the cave mouth moments later. It paused, sniffing the air. This was my chance. My only chance. I struck the flare I'd been carrying and lobbed it deeper into the cave. The magnesium flame erupted, filling the cavern with blinding light and acrid smoke. The dogman howled in pain and fury, momentarily disoriented. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I squeezed past the creature and ran like I'd never run before. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite, quickly grabbing my essentials before continuing onto my truck. As I peeled out onto the road, tires squealing, I finally allowed myself to believe I'd escaped. My hands shook on the steering wheel as the adrenaline wore off. I'd done it. I'd faced the dogman and lived. But as I drove away from those dark woods, a new fear settled in. I knew now that the dogman was real, that it had been hunting humans for untold years, and worst of all, I knew it was intelligent, patient. This wasn't over. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see yellow eyes following me. There was nothing there, but deep down I knew the truth. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because now the dogman knew me, it had my scent, and something told me it didn't like to let prey escape. Sooner or later, it would come for me again. And next time, I might not be so lucky. As I crossed the state line, I made a silent vow. I would be ready. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, I would find a way to stop this creature, to end its reign of terror once and for all. The dogman had made a fatal mistake in letting me live, because now it wasn't just the hunter anymore. It was also the hunted. The years following my second encounter with the Michigan Dogman were a descent into obsession. I couldn't let it go. Every waking moment was consumed by research, planning, preparing. I pored over every scrap of folklore, every reported sighting. I trained my body, honing it into a weapon. I studied tracking, survival skills, even occult practices some claim could ward off the creature. My personal life fell apart. I lost my job, my friends, my family, all sacrificed on the altar of my fixation. But I didn't care. Nothing mattered except my mission: to find the dogman, to kill it. 5 years to the day after my last encounter, I returned to those dark Michigan woods. This time, I wasn't just prepared. I was armed for war. My pack was filled with an arsenal that would make a military unit envious. High-powered rifles, incendiary rounds, state-of-the-art traps. I even had a few items of a more esoteric nature: silver bullets, charms and talismans from a dozen different belief systems. I didn't know what would work, but I was determined to try everything. As I drove into that small town once more, I barely recognized myself in the rearview mirror. My face was gaunt, my eyes haunted. I looked like a man possessed, and in a way, I suppose I was. The locals seemed to sense the change in me. Where before they had been wary, now they were openly hostile. Doors closed as I passed. Mothers hurried their children inside. I heard muttered curses and saw fingers forming warding signs. I ignored them all, let them think what they wanted. I had a job to do. I hiked deep into the forest, going farther than I ever had before. For days I searched, following half-remembered trails and chasing shadow. But there was no sign of the dogman, no howls in the night, no glimpses of yellow eyes in the darkness. As the days stretched into weeks, doubt began to creep in. Had it all been in my head? Had I wasted years of my life chasing a phantom? It was on the eve of the full moon, a month into my expedition, that everything changed. I was huddled in my tent, poring over maps by lamplight, when I heard it. A howl that shook me to my very core. The dogman had found me. I burst out of the tent, rifle at the ready. The forest was bathed in silvery moonlight, shadows dancing between the trees. And there, at the edge of my camp, stood the creature that had haunted my nightmares for 5 long years. It was larger than I remembered, its muscled frame rippling with barely contained power. those yellow eyes fixed on me with predatory intelligence. But there was something else there too. Recognition. It remembered me. For a long moment we stood frozen, hunter and hunted, neither sure which was which anymore. Then, with a snarl that sounded almost like laughter, it turned and bounded into the forest. The chase was on. I tore after it, all thoughts of caution forgotten. Branches whipped my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I pushed on. I could hear it ahead of me, always just out of sight. It was leading me somewhere. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was a trap, but I was beyond reason now. We ran for what felt like hours, deeper into the wilderness than I had ever been. Just when I thought my legs would give out, we burst into a moonlit clearing. In the center stood a structure that stopped me in my tracks. It was a church, or what remained of one. The decrepit building was overgrown with vines, its walls crumbling. The cross that once topped its steeple now hung upside down, swaying gently in the breeze. The Dogman stood in the church's doorway, its massive frame nearly filling the entrance. Those yellow eyes bored into me, filled with a malevolent intelligence that was all too human. Then it stepped inside, swallowed by the darkness. Every instinct told me to run, to flee back to civilization and never return. But I had come too far to turn back now. Gripping my rifle tightly, I stepped into the church. The interior was a study in decay. Rotting pews were overturned, their wood gnawed by unknown teeth. The altar was stained, dark, with what I prayed was just mold. And covering every surface were those crude pictographs I had seen in the cave, depicting centuries of the Dogman's hunts. But it was what hung above the altar that truly chilled my blood. Dozens of skulls dangled from the ceiling, string threaded through empty eye sockets. Some were animal, some human. All were yellowed with age. A low growl drew my attention to the far corner. There crouched the Dogman, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. But it made no move to attack. Instead, it began to change. I watched in horror as its form shifted and twisted. Bones cracked and reformed. Fur receded into skin, and where the monster had been, a man now stood. He was ancient, his skin leathery and covered in scars. A long gray beard fell to his chest, but those eyes, those were the same yellow eyes that had haunted me for years. "Welcome, Thomas Riker," he said, his voice a raspy growl. "I've been waiting a long time for this." I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking too badly to aim. What are you?" The old man smiled, revealing teeth that were still far too sharp to be human. "I am the guardian of these woods, the keeper of ancient secrets. Some call me Wendigo, others Skinwalker. Your people named me Dogman." "But why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why hunt us? Why kill?" "To keep the balance," he replied. "To remind mankind of its place in the natural order. For centuries I have culled those who would despoil these lands, but in recent years your kind has grown too numerous, too destructive. The hunt must intensify." He took a step toward me, and I scrambled backward. "Stay back." The old man chuckled. "Or what? You'll shoot me? Go ahead. Empty your gun. Use every weapon you brought. It won't matter. I am beyond such things now." "Then why am I still alive?" I demanded. "Why not just kill me?" His expression turned serious. "Because you are different, Thomas. You came back. You sought understanding, not just conquest, and so I have chosen you for a greater purpose." Fear gripped me as I realized what he meant. "No, I won't become like you. I won't be a monster." "Monster?" he snarled, anger flashing in those inhuman eyes. "I am nature's wrath given form. I am the spirit of the wild made flesh, and you will be my successor." He lunged at me with impossible speed. I fired, the gunshot deafening in the confines of the church. But the bullets passed through him like smoke. His hands, suddenly clawed once more, gripped my shoulders. I felt a searing pain as something passed from him into me. Ancient knowledge flooded my mind. The weight of centuries pressed down on me. I saw the forests as they had once been, pristine and untouched. I felt the rage as mankind encroached, destroying all in its path. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The old man, the thing that had been the Dogman, began to crumble before my eyes like sand blown in the wind. "The mantle is past," he rasped. "The hunt is yours now. Protect the wild places. Call the destroyers, and when the time comes, choose your own successor wisely." With those final words, he disintegrated entirely. I fell to my knees, my body racked with spasms. Bones cracked and shifted. Muscles tore and regrew. Fur sprouted from my skin. I threw back my head and howled, the sound full of rage and sorrow and hunger. The transformation was complete. I was no longer just Tom Riker. I was the Dogman now. As the first light of dawn filtered through the broken windows, I loped out of the old church. The forest welcomed me, every scent and sound crystal clear to my enhanced senses. I could feel the pulse of the wilderness, the ebb and flow of life all around me. And there, on the edge of my awareness, I sensed them, humans, campers about 5 miles to the east, trespassers in my domain. The hunt was calling. For a moment I hesitated. Memories of my old life flickered through my mind, but they seemed distant now, like a half-remembered dream. I am the guardian now, I thought, the protector of these wild lands. With a final glance at the rising sun, I melted into the shadows of the forest. There was work to be done. The hunt would go on, as it had for centuries. And in years to come, when campers told stories around their fires of yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, of howls that sounded almost human, they would be speaking of me, for I am the Michigan Dogman, and the forests are mine to protect. Craving more creature features? Well, fear not. Starting on November 8th, I will start uploading every other Friday. That will be 2 videos a month. I have a park ranger series that I'll be working on, and some other stories that I want to share. Thank you for listening, and remember to subscribe, share, and to turn on notifications for future videos. Until next time.